Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Coffee with Captain. It's a pretty chilly Saturday morning here in Baltimore. And Captain Miles, what have we been up to in the past week?
Well, we're counting 2 weeks with crew aboard, the sailing crew, the season crew. Today is the 15th day, I guess, and or is it the 14th day? I think it's the 15th
14th.
day. How that goes?
Yeah, okay, 14th. All right. The crew came aboard during a Coffee with Captain episode. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So and they've been all over the place with things to close up, things to open up in preparation of closing up. So we're doing deck work. We're doing systems check and overhaul. We're doing some storing on the ship of stuff that it's going to carry, having taken it off, and it gives us a chance to police all that so that we're not just transporting weight back aboard the boat. It's a way of filtering out some of the weight that could otherwise just keep adding and adding and adding. And then there's a fair amount of cosmetics going on, which is normal, but while the cover's still on. It's always a flexible seasonal response when the cover comes off. And we've had good reason not to take it off, although we wanted to take it off. What with the batter of cyclical snow events and freezing events and with rain. So we've done some training. We've also participated in the Tall Ships America annual conference in the sense that we've given the time for the crew to attend that virtual conference. So we're connected to our community across the nation while still being where we are, they being where they are, instead of getting together in one place.
And you've been to a lot of these Tall Ships America conferences. What's been your experience with the shift to it being virtual?
Well, two things that are really stand out, and that is you don't have to feel like you make a choice between two simultaneous breakout sessions with folks that you want to listen to in terms of their presentation, and you want to participate in any of the question and answer, because they're being recorded and they're being put up so that you can go to one that you haven't been able to participate in and watch that. You can also go back to some of the recordings. So there's some specific information that I want to pick up from a weather presentation because of the links that were put on for resources. The other thing is that we're having we're having a somewhat more intimate exchange quality to the thing. So a crowd is a crowd, and yes, Zooming with 30 people is a little bit interesting and maybe still an experiment to experience how to use in terms of connecting. But there's a lot of effort at group. It's an adventure figuring out how to get together to have a conversation. And having been separated, and we only get together once a year anyway, it's neat to be able to still get together. So there's that factor. But I think carrying forward, the quality of recording, the fact that we can record and leave it stored, so you can go back to to information you find important for yourself, to refresh or go to something you haven't been able to attend, means that I'm hoping that that's something we can continue to do even in conferences where we can get together. So I don't think one substitutes for the other, but I think they can be augmentative. This business of our virtual experience can augment an actual experience for the purposes of information and exchange.
Yeah, that's something that I've been really happy to see, is the amount of access and connection that's available virtually. So yeah, I think you're right on with that analysis of, when we are in person, it would be really great to keep that virtual component.
Yeah, you raised a point about cost. That virtual component, if we maintain it in an actual conference, provides for some of the folks that just can't get away to a conference on the one hand, or folks that travel can be expensive or long length of time to do it. And then, of course, hotel, motel, even when the conference is relatively inexpensive, it's still too expensive for those that might benefit to be able. So the virtual component that the Tall Ships America effort has been making here shows potential. And you pointed this out, and I agree with you completely, is if you maintain it, it means you can broaden the population that's participating and make the community, help keep the community intimate and a sense of inclusion.
Yeah, a sense of inclusion and information sharing, which is hugely important in this industry.
Yeah.
So this morning, it's been a pretty wintry week for us here in Baltimore. So we're going to take this morning and travel away through a bunch of different port stops and experiences that Jan has had through the years. And Patrick has some photos lined up with these different port stops so we can get some visuals of those voyages. And the first one on my list, and I believe on Patrick's as well, is Istanbul. So when did the boat go to Istanbul? Why did the boat go there? What was that experience like?
Well, the two captain program set up such that I actually was not on board for Istanbul, but I've been to Istanbul, so I can talk about the mission and also Istanbul itself. For those of you who of our audience who are pretty interested in the way the world works, Istanbul is smack in between two major societal traditions. The Silk Road story passes right through Istanbul. And when and in the background, a pride right here sailing just in the river that is it goes through Istanbul, passing from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. You see the mosque in the background. That's a fascinating structure. For go to YouTube and look it up, and it's quite amazing story. And then underneath it, there's a great aquifer. There's a pool of water, and in some of the dramatic movies, it's been featured. The purpose, well, back in the early 90s, this is 1991, 90, and partner captain Sid Miller and the crew passed through twice because they were on their way to Odessa in the Ukraine. So Odessa is a sister city to Baltimore. So, but Maryland Port is an importer, exporter port, very active, and freight movement was wide-ranging, is wide-ranging around the world. And so there was an interest in connecting for reasons of passing freight through Baltimore. Also, there's a lot of storytelling to be done with history of Maryland and Baltimore. There's a little bit of that. And what a great photograph, Pride of Baltimore, Maryland's Pride of Baltimore, America's privateer of the 1812 war in Istanbul. How about that, huh?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. The next port stop that we have on the list is London. Were you on the boat with Pride in London?
Yes. So this photograph is 1985. So it's the old Pride of Baltimore. The funny story here, you'll notice that the square topsail doesn't appear to be visible or isn't much visible, but it's there. It's set. I had a a conversation with the photographer Greg Pease about where best. He asked me where best he might stand, and I said, well, based on the wind, which wasn't much, why don't you stand over here? And I'm thinking that we're going to have the topsail all braced up sharp, typical sort of profile. So going through the bridge, the wind shifted, and it wasn't a systemic shift. It was just a zephyr. And I forgot myself, and we had the yards shifted. And of course, it puts them straight on end to the photographer with the camera. So I spoiled this shot completely.
Sometimes the sailing gets ahead of the optics.
Yeah, right. So for those of us who do tall ship festivals, we know how sails can go back, and well, let's make the photograph good, right? Instead of the profile for sailing, get the sails full of wind. Oh boy, I have always gritted my teeth every time I see this photograph. It's a great celebration because there's so many other stories that go with this. Having a conversation with London about going through the bridge as an American flag vessel celebrating the 1812 war with England. It's like, no, we don't want you. We do not want to raise the bridge for you. And so that goes back and forth. That's done all in tongue in cheek, but it was sort of an interesting background. And we wound up spending 3 weekends inside at a dock that's next to the tower. So this is the Tower Bridge, actually, not the London Bridge, the Tower Bridge. And then we were on a dock next to the tower where all the jewelry and the armament of past history is kept. And so it was an interesting 2 full working weeks where we had corporations on board for dockside events, and then weekends of general public walkaboards. And it gave me the opportunity to schedule 2 cycles of 3 or 4 days off per port or starboard watch. And,
oh, wow.
And so they got a lot of tourism going on individually. They could break away for 2-3 days, full days, 3 days, 4 nights, and have 2 cycles of that. So they could, so that was pretty cool in that rotation. It kept us pretty busy because you're doing boat care and cleaning. You're doing a midday social setting event on board, a corporate party. You're doing an evening one with various agencies of the state, city, and of course, private corporations. We also commemorated Lord Calvert, who had a lot to do with the settling of Maryland as a Catholic colony. Yeah, it was a lot going. We also partnered up with the Baltimore Symphony. Can't think of the proper name, but they did an event in a church or somewhere. So we connected with them. It was a pretty big projection. So this is 1985, the old Pride of Baltimore, and yeah, I took her in, and that's where the 2 captains rotated. Armin Assessor then relieved me at the end of our stay in London, and he carried on into the Scandinavian countries. I returned to the boat at the end of the summer in Germany to bring her down to the Med.
Sure. Has the second Pride ever been to London?
Yeah, a couple, 3 times. I was trying to count. Yes, and there's photographs of the second Pride near the bridge. We've been through the bridge once ourselves, but most of the time we go up near the bridge for the photo session, and then we go into a place they call St. Catherine's Dock, which is anyone familiar with the maritime system in London on the Thames River. There you go. There's a number of different pictures. We have one, I think, with some sail up. Anyway, we're not in the London side of the bridge. We're I believe we're still outside of the proper London side of the Tower Bridge. But St. Catherine's Dock is one of those things where they have a series of basins with a door that you, at high water of the river, you then have a short period of time to let the doors open, go into the lock, close the doors, and you can pass a bunch of boats through. We're pretty big with our extensions of the head rig and et cetera for going through this lock. It's a bit cramped. And then we lock into two or three different, a choice of two or three different basins based on the management. So that's pretty interesting because the block is square to the river, and you have two things that could be concerned with: high water, so you have adequate depth, and then you have to worry about the current in the river. So you're perpendicular to the river as you make your entry into the lock. So if there's any current going on, you have to be very, you might not, if you're too late, there might be adequate depth, but if there's any strength to the river, then you won't be able to get into the boat this big because of the tightness of the maneuvering. So everything is really choreographed with the management of the St. Catherine's Dock system to their local knowledge, and then our timing of just making sure we maneuver properly. So that, and then you're inside this basin, and the water level doesn't hardly change at all, a little bit as they play around with the period of time of adequate depth for getting smaller vessels in. But it's you got warehouses, old original warehouses from 2-3 centuries or more back there. So that's all pretty old from an American point of view.
Sure. And you guys must have been just ahead of going into the canal there as the fenders are going over the side, it looks like in this photo.
Well, yeah, it could be. There was one occasion where we were on the river on the opposite side from St. Catherine's Dock with visitation. So because we've been there 2-3 times, this may be that occasion rather than going into the St. Catherine's Dock. I can't see enough detail in the picture to think that I'm certain we're either upriver or downriver of the bridge or not. There's just not enough familiarity on my part. So yeah,
sure.
But we were there a bunch of times with the second boat.
Sure. Was it pretty similar as far as execution of mission for the second boat and what the second boat did in London compared to the first Pride in Baltimore?
Yes, similar. London is a major business city of the world. And so, yes, Maryland interests, American interests to take advantage of the boat did exist, but there was a drop off through the 90s of into the first decade of the next following century, our current century, of use of the boat, the vision of representing themselves through the iconic aspect of the Pride has been is shown to have dropped off, and it's a long, horrible tale of speculative tale as to why. We're not certain. I'm not certain as to why that's going on. I think they're missing a bet. I mean, what wouldn't be a cool thing to be invited as an exclusive invitee aboard Pride by an agency who you do business with? Wouldn't that perception of that business and that perception you think of them thinking of you, wouldn't that be an interesting dynamic in that scenario, with the Pride being in the news, having come to visit London and England? It's an interesting puzzle.
Sure. One that we're currently still puzzling. Yeah. I think the next port up that Patrick has some photos with is Helsinki.
Yes, Helsinki was a blast. Because it was very well scheduled, or very frequently scheduled, with day sails with the second boat. We had one particular summer, we had a lot of activity with the Scandinavian Airlines, and they wanted to bring out a bunch of travel agents in various ports we went to. So in Helsinki, the way that harbor exists is a sheltered harbor, but it has a lot of rocks all around the place. And they've created this, it's almost like looking at an airport runway pattern. And you can pick and choose how you get around in this thing. So there was a lot of maneuvering going on under sail. And so I found it fascinating to navigate and sail through. It was a lot of work for the crew.
Sure.
It's also as far north in the summertime, I think, as Pride's ever been, or a Pride mission has ever been. I think it's a little further north than Stockholm. So you're in the land of the midnight sun, or darn near close to it. So in the summertime, and dark, if it got totally dark, it might be only for 2-3 hours. Rest of the time, it's, you have midnight, it's only twilight, a pretty bright twilight, and then it's back up again around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So if you're not careful, you won't sleep.
Sure. Which can be a problem any year, but especially in those busier ports.
Yeah, right. Because those folks enjoy the summer. They make an effort at maximizing their summer because they have long winters. And so, yeah, you play really, really hard when you're in those areas. So it was very, very interesting, fun for me, and a little wear and tear on the hard on the crew, I think.
Sure. And I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here. And this may be the nature of the many sails that were being done in Helsinki. But I noticed that the main gaff topsail is tacked down on the leeward side of the peak halyard there, which is not our current setup. Our current setup is to actually go through the peak halyard. Was that something that was still being played around with, or was this just crew didn't get to it? Because that also sometimes happens.
Yeah, no, I was messing around with first of all, we always flip the sail to leeward because of resting against the peak halyards is in an ocean circumstance where you got a lot of motion is going to be chafe. If you're just in smooth water, it's not that big a deal. If a topsail, the gaff topsail is leaning against the peak halyards because there's no rubbing going on, might
Sure.
be pressure,
Patrick,
but
can you use your mouse and kind of highlight the area we're talking about?
And
Yeah.
so, but because of the ocean travel of the boat, and we use that sail out in the ocean, we put it to leeward of the peak part, so there isn't that chafing with the motion going on. And I did mess around with looking at it and trying to assess the relative value of having it tucked the way you described it, where we take the tack and bring it down the windward side of the mainsail, while having the sail on the leeward side of the peak halyards. And I went back and forth the first 3 or 4 years trying to figure out what is the difference is. One of the things is that if you don't put the tack down the windward side, it's just generally easier on the crew to make the sail go from one side to the other. But
Sure.
if you go and put it the way we're doing it now, where the tack of the sail, the bottom of the sail is to windward of the gaff, while the sail is to leeward of the peak parts, there's a bit of, as you know, there can sometimes be a pretty heavy struggle. So in the end, we've kept to this pattern that you described, which you don't see in the photograph. Then I got a comment. And the reason why we kept to it is because I thought aerodynamically it was a better way of getting power out of the combination of the sail, 2 sails. And someone came along who's a highly knowledgeable fellow, came along and said, you're not actually improving things, because you need to ventilate between those 2 sails. If you leave it to leeward, you get more airflow across the top of the gaff. You're not actually creating a jib-headed sail by doing what you're doing. And when you do what you're doing, you're choking off the flow going across the top of the mainsail.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Sure.
So there's if we had another Pride of Baltimore that was exactly like this Pride of Baltimore, we could trial them like the America's Cups, then
Sure.
we could maybe prove that. or maybe if we had an air tunnel with a good modeling to represent the differences, maybe we could prove that out. But anyway, and I don't disagree with them. It's just that I like it this way, so we're doing it this way. And so maybe we ought to go back and just try. We've done it this way for so long. Maybe we ought to spend some time doing it the other way just to see what it feels like.
Yeah, we could play around with that a bit this year. It would be a fun experiment. And if anybody is, sitting around on a pile of cash that they, really want to answer this question, feel free to get in touch with us so we can just, build a second boat and, match race and answer some of these long-term questions. All right, so the next port, we're going to shift gears. Oh, we're not shifting gears yet. The next port that Pat has is St. Petersburg.
Yes, there we were. That was. We're actually in the river right near the Admiralty. That's the Admiralty there, and it being in St. Petersburg. Then at the time it was still Leningrad. It hadn't shifted from the Soviet Union had. The Soviet system had not collapsed. That didn't happen for another half a year to a year. So that and being in it's like being at the right next to the naval military headquarters, being off the Admiralty. So there was a security interest under the American flag. We were there for 4th of July in 1991, and we got a chance to take the American consulate general and his guests for a sail in the River Neva there, between bridges. Now, the River Neva is a major transportation arm, and they have an interesting system. It reaches so far inland that when it comes to getting freight from inland all the way to the ocean service port, which is still way out in the river delta area, the Neva, they raise so many of these bridges for one-way traffic. So they start around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and they have downriver traffic first. And this is a period of time of maybe 3 to 4 hours. The bridges are up, and then upbound small boat traffic to bring freight up the river happens. And so meanwhile, we're there for about a week, 5 days to 6 days. We and then again, we're still in the land of the midnight sun during the summertime. So we had the social, we were near a park, and so there was a lot of people looking at the boat being docked right there. We were very nicely welcomed. There was a bit of a disagreement upon arrival about, well, why did you stay down here in the commercial port? And they had agreed after a lot of conversation to allow us up, and we'd have to have a pilot. We eventually made the river run up in the dark without the pilot because they just wouldn't show up. So there's this a bit of gamesmanship about, well, if they don't have a pilot, they can't go. And then so we'll keep them down in the commercial port. But I had a translator who understood the situation. So he said, Captain, we got to go. And it wasn't unsafe because it's a navigable river and it's really, really clear to do, and the lights and what have you. So up we went, and we got all moored up, and I think the city mayor or his chief leader, they just said American way. So we had enough time there that we could have some of the crew take more than just a day off at a time, and we had some crew take a train ride and get escorted up to a project that was a Russian frigate of centuries ago that was being built. It has been sailing around for a while now. St. Petersburg, as it is now, is really quite an interesting town. It's kind of like a Venice of the North. There's a lot of canals that you can tour through. So anyway, that was really cool being there for that.
Yeah, some very stunning photos. We're going to shift gears here, and we're going to head back to the States on this virtual voyage, so to speak. And this next port is up in the Great Lakes, and we've been to the Great Lakes a number of times. I've been to the Great Lakes on this boat a number of times. And the first port we're going to talk about is Bay City, Michigan.
So Bay City, we wouldn't, okay, first of all, the story of the Pride mission, starting with the Pride of Baltimore, first Pride of Baltimore, going into the lakes, is related to the business of representing the city as a port and tourism, Maryland as a tourism, and the city as a tourism destination to the middle of the country. So there was good reason to just go in the lakes on our own. But starting in the year 2000, Tall Ships America started these Tall Ship Challenge festivals, Tall Ship Festival series. And Bay City was one of the cities that wanted to have this festival. So that was a reason for going to Bay City with a group of other tall ships to participate in that festival. So we've been there numerous times. And Bay City is way up a narrow river, way up an arm of Lake Huron. That is, if you're looking at the maps and you imagine Lake Huron as the back of your hand with your thumb stuck out, the thumb is the shallow tributary off to the west of the central part of Lake Huron. And then you have the river going up into the farm country of Michigan from the east side. And the hospitality and the enthusiasm of Bay City as a festival port destination has been steady, very enthusiastic, very welcoming. I don't know, for every third year. Great Lakes Tall Ship Challenge festivals are organized every 3 years so far. And so each time they've been very enthusiastic to have the boats visit.
Yeah, being from the Midwest, the maritime culture and kind of history that I grew up with the most would be, the iron ore carriers, so not the wooden sailing vessels that inhabited the lakes for many hundreds of years before the Iron Fleet came along. So it's really cool to see these festivals throughout all the Great Lakes because it brings that maritime history to the forefront, which exists throughout the lakes. But definitely when I was a kid growing up, it was all about these, the like 1,000-footer ore carriers, and that was the focus of maritime history. So yeah, a lot of fun up in the lakes.
Yeah, so my first time in the lakes was the old Pride of Baltimore, 1981. And that's when I got an intimate appreciation for how enthusiastic the population of the Great Lakes on both sides of the border are for any kind of boat. They're just cuckoo about boats, and saltwater boats included. So the point that you're making is they love their boats, and they think the highest of their own boats, the long Lakers, which still are a big appreciation today in the modern world. But they also love the visiting vessels. And so these tall ship festivals with their own sailing vessels of the lakes that are anchored in, that are operated in the lakes during the summertime as education platforms or recreation platforms, as well as the saltwater boats, they're equally appreciated. And of course, for the saltwater boats, it's always surrounded by land. We just can't get any relief. It doesn't matter how big the lake is. You're always on a lee shore in a sailboat. So it's like, your navigation weather balance as a sailboat operator is highly tuned to the fact that no matter what the wind direction is, there's land just over the horizon.
Yeah, and of course, I very much appreciate the tall ships doing this Great Lake circuit. So I'm originally from Duluth, Minnesota, and the boat has been there numerous times, and that is where I first came on board on the Pride of Baltimore. Was in my home port, as far inland as you can get, and still be attached to the ocean, in Duluth. So moving on to a different American port, we have Boston. And Boston is one that we've been to a number of times.
Sure. I mean, how can you sail the New England Northeast coast without going to Boston? And Boston has a long sail history, a sail vessel history, much equally with, well, maybe even earlier than Baltimore, by not a lot, but some. So yes, a great, tremendous enthusiasm for unique vessels, different vessels, and then also a host for tall ships. They've had some major events. The Second Pride participated in the 500 years of Columbus's trip across. There was a major host port. Boston was a major host port. The millennia celebration also, and it's a big enough harbor that Pride can get away from the dock and do some day sails and take public out. Again, we're licensed, unlike the old boat, which could not carry anybody for a sail. Therefore, all the events were dockside. When it came to parties, Pride Baltimore 2 can be used by any interest to have an intimate experience going sailing on Pride. Group of 35 people, and so Boston Harbor is good, like Baltimore Harbor is good for getting around and going for a sail in relatively sheltered conditions. And of course, it's the home of our Constitution, USS Constitution, and she's a great draw, and of course the Boston history as a colony port turning into a part of the becoming a country. So it's a neat town to go to.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite things, when Tall Ships America does these port festivals, anytime that they throw something like Boston into the mix, there's usually a huge representation from the international fleet. And that's really awesome to be a part of. Just a bunch of history there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
We're going to move up to our Canadian friends. One of my favorite ports, which is Lunenburg, Nova Scotia.
Sure. Lunenburg. Who doesn't want to go to Lunenburg? In the early years, Lunenburg was not a regular visited port because of Halifax. And Halifax did some tall ship festival stuff in the first 10 years of this century. But as that has dropped off for I don't know what reason, Lunenburg has been the port to go to, and it's not very far from Halifax by land, maybe an hour's drive or hour and a half drive. So from a customs international point of view, clearing customs and immigration in Lunenburg works very, very well. And it's a closer to the ocean than Halifax docks are. So there's a certain convenience there to go. And then, of course, its history as a fishing port and continues to be a fishing port. The history of the fishing schooners is centered in Lunenburg for Canada. And that's the home of the Bluenose too. And of course was part of the history of the Bluenose. In fact, this year they're commemorating the launching 100 years ago this year of the first Bluenose. So it's a great town to go visit. Very intimate. It has a lot of the structure that has been around a long time, so it hasn't been bulldozed down and rebuilt new. So there's still a lot of cultural classicness up there.
Yeah, still very much Canadian fishing town, which is really great. And of course, the captain of the Bluenose too, Phil Watson, was on a Coffee with Captain episode late last year. So if you want to check that out,
It's
it would be on
also,
our YouTube channel.
yeah, Lunenburg is also the headquarters town for the world girdling 7 times, getting ready to do it 8 times, Picton Castle with Captain Daniel Moreland. And so their offices are in Lunenburg, and that's where the Picton Castle is right now, weathering out this pandemic, getting ready to make yet another trip around the world. I think they're thinking they could hopefully maybe get underway in the latter part, late in the year. I think they're talking about late in the year. So they have to be careful about departure because of weather patterns in the Pacific relative to tropical cyclones. So you don't want to go at any time because you could wind up being stuck with crossing the Indian Ocean at a time that's not so good because of the risk of tropical cyclones. And also in the Southern Pacific, as you cross towards the western side, you have to be careful about that timing. So he'd hoped to get underway spring of this year, but the pandemic doesn't permit for that, but maybe in the fall. So he has to wait for the cycle to work. So that's the current thinking. So, and they have an interesting history in that port. They've been very helpful at helping the local community realize they could lose a lot of their classic history structure of fishing through development. So they've been converting some of the older buildings along the waterfront by purchasing them up and then preserving them rather than having one single owner sell them for the big money that can go with development. So that's a very community decision that Picton Castle helped with.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. And we're going to do one last port stop here on our virtual adventure. And that's going to be going out to the West Coast, San Francisco.
Yeah, San Francisco. The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. Some paraphrase of Mark Twain. So that Venturi that goes on in the gap where the Golden Gate is brings in, first of all, that the hillside, both north and south, that the bridge is going between, are high elevations, and so the Pacific in the western side of the Pacific, or eastern side of the Pacific, excuse me, there's a propensity to have a high pressure system, and that means it's pushing wind towards the east. And so when it funnels through the gap, it brings in a lot of moisture. So between the chill of the wind and the amount of moisture, when you're near the waterfront on the San Francisco side, it is cold, it is wet, it is damp, and it's not raining. It's just plain high humidity, foggy stuff. So that's what's going on here. And that's a great photograph. I nicknamed that photograph The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and you can choose which one is which. So that's a rendezvous with Wanderbird that we did in 1983 with when Pride went out there. The Armin O'Sessor sailed Pride out to San Francisco, and then it stayed there bouncing around between Oakland and San Francisco. I took over in Oakland from Armin I think it was in April of that year. And Armin said, "Hey, Jan, we've been talking to Harold Summer of the Wanderbird and been promoting a race between the two boats. You ought to go over there and see how that's going to play out." So there's a wonderful ferry system in that bay. So I took a ferry from Oakland to San Francisco to Sausalito, and Harold entertained me aboard for lunch. And he was very cautious. The boat didn't have an engine at that time, but it had recently concluded a reconstruction over several years and a rig. And so, and he was dubious about racing because he was proud, like anyone would be, about didn't want to be shown up. So I said, "Well, how about a cruising company? You know, we just sail around together." So what you're seeing there are photographs of sailing around together. But at the very end, it was a sail from the south to the north, from the Oakland Bridge between San Francisco and Oakland towards Sausalito. So we went past the Rock, and then after passing San Francisco, crossed the bay up into Sausalito, near Sausalito. And we were a little bit ahead of Wanderbird and to leeward. She was a little bit to windward and behind us. And they called by radio and said, look, because we don't have an engine, we need some ability to just glide right in. We can't wait for you to dock. So would you mind if we go in first? And I said, sure, no, that makes great sense. So, because we had an auxiliary engine and we would just motor up to the dock. Well, the newspaper headline out of San Francisco was Sausalito 1, Baltimore 0. So I got a lot of heat from the board of directors about how'd that happen. I said, well, it wasn't really a race. But, hey, local pride being local pride, it exists everywhere. So that was really quite a neat thing. I think this photo is actually Armin Osesser bringing pride into San Francisco before he and I exchanged places. But when we did that sail in company, the photograph effort was tremendous. And so that's where some of the great dynamic shots of Wanderbird and Pride of Baltimore sailing, gambling about together as two rambunctious dogs, young pups might be, running around. It was a lot of work for all the crew. It's also the occasion where we converted from passing the topsail last, because we got into a situation in attack where the tradition was to pass the lowers and then pass the topsail. And that makes sense because you're trying to blow the bow off after attack with the topsail. But we wound up doing 6 knots to windward with the topsail hard aback. It took the entire crew to bring the topsail around going to windward. I said, okay, we're shifting everything around. We do the topsail first and then we do the lowers, which is easy because everything's loose footed. As you know, sailing this boat, there's no problem with any of that stuff going aback, but it's a big problem with the topsails going aback and you're doing 6 knots through the water. So the apparent wind up aloft is going to be upwards of 15 to 20. So it's to get that kind of power with a sail aback, you're dealing in 15, 18 knots of true wind. So the apparent wind goes high, and trying to get that topsail around when you're already doing that kind of speed. So that's where we shifted and reversed everything.
Sure. Has the second boat ever been to San Francisco?
A couple times. So in 94, and then again in 98, coming back from the Asia with Pride campaign. I was aboard her for the 94 trip, and then Captain Moreland was aboard her for the 98 stop.
Nice. Well, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in this morning, and I hope you enjoyed this voyage away from the snowy, cold weekend of Baltimore and exploring these different ports. If you want to catch up on previous episodes and those sea stories, check out our YouTube channel. There's all of our previous Coffee with Captain episodes there. I want to just give a big shout out to anybody who donated. That really helps keep this program going. Tune in next week, Saturday morning. We'll have another episode ready for you. And Captain Miles, you have any parting words for us?
Always, as always, stay diligent in whatever you do. Stay diligent.